So I work with families in the Bronx, and we work with families that are impacted by poverty every day. My program works with 84 families, and virtually all our families live below the poverty line, and all receive some form of government benefits. We're primarily home and community based, and we work with families who provide family sessions in their home. We go to public assistance with them, go to mental health clinics with them, to family court. Whatever the family needs, we provide to them. And tonight I'm going to share with you the experience of a family that I'm working with right now. In the last 10 days, I've seen the family 4 times. This is a family who has had significant systems involvement for the last 10 to 12 years of their life. ACS became involved over 10 years ago, and foster care is still involved. It's a family with a 2-parent family with 3 children in their home, and they are planning for a 4th child to be returned to them. Last week, the family went to court, and they did find out that they would be getting their daughter back through a trial discharge from foster care. I saw them at home the day after, and they were so happy. I'm not even sure when the last time they had custody of their child. There was a trial discharge back in 2007, which was not successful, and that's 6 years ago. I was supposed to meet the family at the foster agency last week for the trial discharge conference. I was running late because there was a sick passenger on the train. And when I got there, Dad was in the waiting area with his daughter. There was no other family members or workers present. He let me know that he'd gotten there late. By the time he got there, the facilitator had left. We went to meet with the supervisor to talk about the plan for his daughter. And when we sat down, we were informed that because the conference didn't happen and the facilitator was gone, he couldn't take his daughter home with him that day. I'm sorry, it's funny, you work for so many years and I still get kind of emotional when this has happened. I've read my speech like 10 times and I still get a little bit shaky. The look on his face when he was told that one sentence was probably one of the most devastating things I've ever seen. Dad explained that they were running late. They planned to have their 6-year-old child home with his brother so they could come to the meeting, him and his wife. But the brother had to go to Queens to get fingerprinted for their public assistance case. Now, the Public Assistance Center for families that live in shelters is in Queens, regardless of what borough the families live in. So from the Bronx, he had to get to Queens. So that was a day-long commitment. And if he didn't go that day, that could end up impacting their public assistance case. So the mom and dad waited for their youngest son, jumped up on the train, and then headed to the agency, which was 2 boroughs away from where they lived. On the train, their child had a seizure. They had to get off the train, call an ambulance, and wait for EMS. And Dad knew that he was cutting it close on time, but the mom gets anxious. She has anxiety and depression. So he waited because he wanted to make sure Mom was okay, and then, of course, that his son was okay. And he did leave when EMS got there. So how am I linking this to poverty? All these small events that happen that day are connected to their lack of resources, their need to comply with government assistance programs, and the requirements of the child welfare system. That day, Dad didn't bring his phone because the charger doesn't fit inside the phone, so the battery was dead. He can't afford to buy a new phone right now because of limited finances, so he couldn't call the agency to let them know what happened. While he was waiting for the ambulance, they were actually pretty close to the agency. It was just over the bridge, the next borough. We didn't have money for a taxi, which would have saved time. And as it turns out, he literally had just missed the facilitator. And so all those small events just impacted that larger decision of his child not going home with him that day. His daughter has special needs. When he tried to explain to her again that she wasn't coming home with him today, she got upset and she said, "Daddy, no, I go home with you." So he shook his head and was not really able to continue speaking. So this girl who I'd never met before, I had to explain to her why she couldn't go home with her family that day. She got upset and she was able to calm down. And Dad and I continued to talk about his frustration about how the facilitator was not there and how he thought he had just missed her. And while we were talking, we realized that the sick passenger that I was delayed behind on the train was actually his son. When I think about how all these different events come to play in this situation, the PA appointment, having to wait for their son to get home from school because both parents did have to be at the conference and they didn't know anybody in their shelter that they trusted enough to take their son. Their son getting sick, not being able to call us, not having money for a taxi, all added up to have delay the reunification just a little while longer. And again, when thinking about poverty, I have to ask myself, if this family had been upper class, middle class, even lower middle class, if they had been white, if they had been able to afford a private attorney, would we still be having a trial discharge so many years after the original call to ACS? 6 years after the previous trial discharge? Would they still be waiting? I don't think so. So there's good news. The plan was to come back on Monday to have a meeting again. On Monday, I arrived for the conference. They had already started. Mom, dad, daughter, everybody was there smiling. It was a remarkable difference from Friday. We were able to talk about what the plan is for the family and what the next steps are. So dad asked me if we could get the daughter a Happy Meal to celebrate her homecoming. And when we were at McDonald's, dad shared that he'd been going to his back-to-work program for public assistance in the morning. So that day he went to his program, then back home after to pick up his wife because she doesn't travel alone, and then came straight down to the meeting. He had not yet eaten that day and it was already 4 p.m. He asked me very quietly if it was okay if he was able to get something to eat too. And I told him of course, and to pick out what he wanted. I could tell it was very hard for him to ask, but I was glad that he did. The choices that he had to make that day to get there on time, supporting his wife so she would have somebody to travel with, and not having extra money to buy a snack are the daily decisions that he faces. There was a lot of belongings for the family to bring back home. It was definitely too much for the family to take on the train. They couldn't afford a taxi, and dad offered just to come back multiple times to the agency back and forth to get everything. I texted my boss. I asked if we could spring for a taxi, which is about $60. And we were able to utilize our client assistance funds, so we arranged for a taxi to take them home. When we went outside, it was such a different atmosphere than when we left last Friday. The family was joyful to be around each other. There were smiles all around. The daughter was excited to get into a cab to go see her siblings. I asked if they would be happy to see her when she got there, and she responded yes with a big smile. She started clapping. I had told the family I wouldn't be in touch till next week. I wanted to give them some time to get reacquainted and to readjust to their daughter being back home. But unfortunately, no, I had to get in touch with them yesterday. I talked to their shelter worker about the daughter being back home and needing a bed now. She informed me because the family, you have to sign in at a shelter, but the sign book for this family is not on site. And dad's in DTW, and mom gets nervous while traveling alone, so they haven't been signing into their book. So they got logged out of their shelter. So I talked to this worker last week also, and I wasn't informed anything about this. And there's no worker on site that can inform the family. And just to give you a sense of what their shelter is like, when I walk in the front gate of their shelter, the front door lock is always broken. There's usually garbage in the courtyard. There's no overhead lights. The door to the building itself is broken as well. Sometimes the elevator doesn't work, and there's always people smoking marijuana in the hallways. I also cut a whole page, so I will be done my time allotted. Sorry. There's people smoking marijuana in the hallways. I say hi to them, and they say hi back, it's fine, but this shelter is not unusual for the families that we work with. It's been reported by some people in the news that they think families stay in city shelters because it's comfortable. My staff and I have been in many city shelters, and I have yet to find one that's very comfortable. So I called Dad. We made arrangements to be at PATH this morning. I wrote an advocacy letter asking that they can hopefully stay at a shelter in the Bronx, and this morning at PATH was my 4th visit with them in 10 days, when originally we had just had one planned. This story with its ups and downs is not atypical of the families we work with. Wanting to have your family all together, but facing challenges from the foster care system. Wanting to live on your own, but facing limited housing programs and unaffordable apartments. Wanting a job, but living in the borough with the highest unemployment rate in the city. Going to a back-to-work program, but getting referrals for jobs with salaries that a family of 6 cannot survive on. These are the daily decisions our clients are faced with. I think social workers play an extremely important role in our clients' lives. We are their advocates, their supporters, their interpreters, their clinicians, their case managers. We are everything to our clients that we can possibly be, with the goal of our clients not needing us anymore at all. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, move along. Beth? See women's first.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I am in the happy position of really preaching to the choir here. I work for AARP, as was stated before, so I'm the state director for New York. And you can imagine all the issues that we work on. And I have statistics on so much that I feel like you probably know this inherently in the work that you do, and you could cite these statistics right along with me. So just out of curiosity, how many of you work in senior services? Okay, well, I'm expecting to see a lot of nodding heads here as I go through this. Okay. I guess what I need to do is just start with the fact that nearly half of the 65 plus population in New York City has now risen to almost be in the ranks of the poor or the near poor. That's striking. I mean, it's just, I see someone making a face. It is horrible. And of course, we all know that, in certain boroughs, it's even worse. So if you're in the Bronx, it continues to have the highest poverty level in the city, with just over 30% of the residents living below federal policy standard. And we know that that standard has nothing to do with the reality of the cost of living in New York. Manhattan has had the largest increase of nearly 2 percentage points, so it's now up to 18.3%, as compared to the year before, where the rate was 16.4%. Living in the poverty rate. That's amazing that it turned around that quickly. And when you look at some of the specific demographics in New York City and the people living in poverty, so it was 17.2% in 2010. And in 2011, it rose to 19%. I mean, that's it's scary when you're hearing these numbers. And here's an example, so you can think of the perspective of New York across the rest of the country. Across the rest of the country, that rate is at 9%. So we're sitting at almost double that rate here in New York City. So if you're all struggling and you're wondering why it's so bad for all your clients, here's the reason why. And I know you know this, but the threshold for poverty for 65 plus in 2012 for somebody living alone was $11,000, and for a two-person household, $13,878. And I gave you the 2012 numbers, so I know those numbers. So as poverty has risen, so has the percentage of the people who are receiving food stamps. And Jared talked a little bit about food stamps. According to census figures, 20.6% of New Yorkers are using food stamps. In 2011, that number was 19.3%. So should we feel better that more people are accessing food stamps? I know ARP is spending an awful lot of time along with the Department for Aging and the Food Bank and CSCS and trying to get more older people signed up for food stamps. And I think we're succeeding, but I'm not sure that that's quite the answer of what we're looking for. Because in fact, if you really want to get right down to the nitty-gritty, 1 out of every 2 seniors in New York City who are eligible for food stamps are not getting it. Is that amazing? I mean, so, well, we got a lot more work to do because there's a whole heck of a lot of people we can be signing up for food stamps. However, if those of you who keep track of the Farm Bill, and Jared could probably speak to that much more intelligently than I can, there's a huge threat around that. So, as a matter of fact, I met with the Food Bank of New York City today, and they are now measuring the amount of meals that people need in New York City. So they have measured that New York City needs 218 million meals in order, that's the meal gap, in order to feed people who are hungry, right? And if you take all of the food providers in New York who are doing that kind of work, Food Bank, Sea Harvest, et cetera, we're talking about 100 million that they're at. So we've got a gap right there. And now we've got the Farm Bill coming in, which between the House proposed bill and the Senate proposed bill, if you put it all together, New York City alone will be raised another 181 million meal gap. So we're never keeping up. We can never keep up with the food needs. And so you can almost imagine with the influx of boomers what that's going to mean. So I'm going to stop on food stamps for a second and move into chain CPI. Does everybody know chain CPI? Okay, so that's the president and Congress are looking at switching over from calculating the increase on Social Security from using the COLA to now using the chain CPI. So what does chain CPI sound? I mean, it sounds like mumbo jumbo. It's like inside the beltway conversation. But what it really means is they're going to use a different formula to calculate. They're going to use a different formula. And that formula doesn't include utilities, it doesn't include drugs, and it doesn't include healthcare costs. Well, what are the needs that seniors have? I mean, that's their lives, unfortunately. And it's not going to be in there. So to give you an example of what that would mean, for New York State, it would mean $8.5 billion in less money coming into the state in the next 10 years for those recipients. And for New York City, $2.5 billion. So think about what that means to the recipients, but then think about what that means to your local economies, right? Because that means that's less money for people to go in the grocery store with, that's less money for the dry cleaner, that's less money for bodegas. So everybody's paying taxes, right? Small businesses, they're gonna have less money in there. And actually, they've calculated that, back to food stamps, for every $5 in food stamps, $9 is then an economic stimulus to the local economy. So you can just think about these numbers played out. I'm going to skip ahead because I know I've got to wind up here. But I guess what I want to end up is what I learned in social work school. I didn't go to Hunter. I went to Yeshiva. However, what they taught me is that you never lead a crowd if you're a community organizer without an action step. So I'm going to give you two of them. One is call Schumer, call Gillibrand, call your members of Congress and tell them to look out for us with the formula. Gillibrand did a great press conference this week about it, but there's a whole bunch of people who are not strongly behind this, and we need to let them know what that's going to mean to our clients and to our economy. And then the second one is the change CPI, because that is going to be devastating to seniors. By the time a 90-year-old, which we're all hopefully living longer, right, it will mean a month of their salary a year, their Social Security, will be cut. So I'm going to stop there. Call your time.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Robert Hawkins. I am a faculty member at the Silver School of Social Work, and I'm a fellow with the McSilver Institute, and I like to say that I know a little bit about poverty. Let's see, maybe I don't. And so I teach policy, I teach poverty courses, teach policy analysis at the Silver School in social work. And so, often I hear from students, oh, I'm going to be a poor social worker, which may or may not, money is not why a lot of people get into the field. But then they also say things like, I'm a poor student now, and then I'm going to be a poor social worker. And I have to remind them that they are not poor, they are broke. And there's a big difference between those two things. And so when I think about poverty, poverty is the idea of missed and closed access to education and opportunities and jobs. And it really reduces life chances. And this is one thing that Dr. Bernstein has spoken about. But I know we have an economist in the room, and so we should be respectful, because economists like to think about numbers. And numbers are extremely important to, certainly to poverty. But poverty is so much more than just numbers. It's so much more. When we start to look at policy, so let's take something like the Earned Income Tax Credit, which I'm a big fan of the Earned Income Tax Credit. Many of the economists, social workers, policy scientists I know love we're dancing in the street over the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is great. But if we think about the real cost of poverty, the real numbers, we say that the Earned Income Tax Credit lifts families out of poverty. Absolutely does. You get no argument from me. But does it lift people into a lifestyle that increases their access to education, their access to work? Not so much. If you look at the average at about $3,000, and for a family of four, the poverty rate is about $23,000. That $26,000 at the end of the year makes that extra $3,000 makes a huge difference. But it's not worth dancing in the street over. And so what we're doing with our policies are creating policies that really focus on, the majority of our policies focus on really sort of maintaining a Band-Aid, as Dr. Jarrett said. And we need so much more, but that takes an investment that that I'm not seeing when I look at the policy work, when I look at what's going on. Dr. Sullivan, in the beginning of this conversation, said that poverty has been swept under the rug in New York City, and I think poverty has been swept under the rug in this country. If we look at our current policies right now, one of the things that we have a focus on the middle class, and it's hard to argue that we shouldn't focus on the middle class. So as we think about increasing employment, as we think about tax credits, those things that policy can do in order to improve people's situations, we're not looking at the very poor. We're not looking at the truly disadvantaged, and there are many reasons for that. Well, one reason is that the poor, they don't vote. At least they don't vote in large blocks. Another reason is that the money, the movements in this country come from the grassroots, yes, but they're not funded by the coalitions. They're funded by that 1%. And that was one of the great things about Barack Obama's first election, that it came from, it was largely funded by so many grassroots, so many of those $5 donations. And that made a difference. And that's why a lot of us expected that, because we are the grassroots, that's why a lot of us expected that real change would happen. Mm-hmm. But then we forgot that Obama is still a black man in America, but I'll get to that in a minute. So we'll come back to that. But I want to really talk briefly, and I know I only have 1.02 seconds. I just want to think about jobs. Think about jobs and think about job trainings. One of the things, and there are many things that we have to pay attention to. We have to pay attention to race. We have to pay attention to structural racism, I should say. We have to pay attention to identity. We have to pay attention to some of these things that Dr. Jarrett mentioned. And one is jobs. So I'm old enough, and I hate to admit it, but I'm old enough to have benefited from something that I'm going to say most of you might not remember, called CETA, the Comprehensive Education Partnership Act, replaced by JTPA, also benefited from that. These were job training programs that ultimately were ruled too expensive, as if unemployment was somehow cheaper. And so those programs were discontinued that focus on, those were work programs and those were educational programs. I feel like I'm at the Academy Awards. But we need more of that. We need more of the job development and the educational development for the truly disadvantaged in this country. So I have to stop there.
Thank you. Okay, any questions for Dr. Person? Sure. Yeah,
So
absolutely.
I'm going to throw one more quick number at you. So Social Security recipients in New York who rely on Social Security for 90% or more of their income is 22.6%. And those who rely upon Social Security for 50% or more of their income is 47.6%. So this is not. So this is not about middle class here. We're talking about people who this is Social Security is in. So how do we, back to what you were saying before, change the dialogue that we're not just holding the line, but how are we becoming more aggressive and more forceful about this when at the same time the government is putting Social Security up on the table?
Well, I can answer that. The only people who are talking about cutting back on retirement security are people whose retirements are very secure. I mean, the way I liked your point at the end of your presentation, Beth, because you talked about making phone calls. It's these facts, and I think you have to. I mean, we have to find a better way than just listing sort of, a list of facts because people's eyes glaze over. But it's these facts. If we can especially show how they're embedded in the actual lives of real people, that I think will make a difference. I can't tell you how many debates I've had on this issue, including the chain CPI, where I've pointed out, wait a minute, the median earnings, the typical income of the typical Social Security or Medicare beneficiary is about $25,000, okay? The minute you say that, everybody understands they can't take a benefit cut. I mean, people get that. Now, I'm not saying that, Eric Cantor gets that, and that's important. And so, we have to be mindful of but I think that the facts have to be marshaled to people whose lives, it's what I said at the very beginning of my talk. The reason I said that stuff on the Marsh show about social workers is not because, it's cool to be a social worker, it's because social workers know the kinds of actual real world facts and constraints that the people we're talking about in policy, which the economists and policymakers don't know, actually face. I think Robert's comments got this as well. And so we have to link the numbers to the people so that policymakers, when they talk about a benefit cut for Social Security, aren't thinking about themselves and their hundreds of thousands of dollars of income, but are thinking about someone who's 90% of their income is Social Security.
Thank you. Robert?
So this is more something for you to ponder rather than a question. You had mentioned that in calculating the poverty rates, that they don't include benefits, which is
Some benefits, yeah.
Absolutely true. But they also don't include the actual cost of living. And so I'm wondering if there is an approach that we should take that somehow it includes that. I mean, I know that there are some models out there, and you can speak to those probably, but is there another way that we should be looking at?
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, first of all, let's just, so the audience, I know you know this, but just to be clear for the audience, the poverty measures are adjusted for the consumer price index, but I think what Robert's getting at is that they don't include the cost of living, and Beth made some comments in that regard as well. They don't include the cost of living that actually all members of the panel, if you think about Elizabeth's family, so many costs that they face, kids having seizures on the subway, those costs aren't reflected in poverty. Well, in fact, the alternative measure that I showed in one of my graphs does a slightly better job of incorporating some of the cost of living. So for example, that measure actually adjusts for difference in housing costs across the country, which is really important because it really does cost a lot more to live in New York than in Mississippi, so you'd want your price index to reflect that. So you can try to, it does a better job with medical costs as well. So you can try to tweak your measures that way. I think the other way to think about it, though, is to think about poverty less in these kinds of absolute cutoff terms and more in relative terms. So think about, by that I mean our poverty lines are sort of these absolute measures. If your income is below $22,000, you're poor, if it's above, whatever. I mean, obviously that doesn't make a ton of sense. What about people right on the edge? So I think if we think about it more broadly and think that there's a median out there, so there's the 50th percentile. If your income is, say, below some share of the median, you're probably falling behind in a relative sense. If your median is, say, below, if your income is below, say, 70% of the median, I'm just pulling a number out of the air, that is one that they use in this research. And it's always going to be arbitrary. But at least that moves in a way with the rest of the economy and with the income distribution in ways that seem a little more resonant to me.
Thank you. Elizabeth?
direct practice side, one of the things that strikes me is how the policies that impact the families we work with seem to not make common sense sometimes. So we have, there's a program that we utilize for housing assistance that you have to have an active public assistance case to get this housing assistance. And if you do not have cash assistance anymore, then you can't maintain your housing rental subsidy. So basically the way the subsidy is set up is to set up people not to go look for work, which is the opposite of what the intention of public assistance is. But for I guess as a direct practitioner, what can we do or what should we do to try to get this information or to have these conversations with people who actually can impact the policy?
Good question. I mean, I think the policy, this is something I remember, learning about back in social work school, many a decade ago. We tend, back then we called them cliff effects. I don't know what they're called them now, but the idea was that since these programs are means tested, when your earnings go above a certain level, you lose the benefit. So there's this disincentive to work. At the same time, everybody's yelling at you, go to work. So you're right, the policy pushes in different directions. I testified on this very issue, and I wrote testimony that you might find useful. It's on the Center on Budget and Policy Priority website. The members of Congress, and this was the House, so this is the committees are run by the majority, so the majority, conservative Republican run this committee, and they were complaining about cliff effects, the very thing you're talking about. And myself and some other witnesses pointed out to them, the reason you have cliff effects is because these programs, you want these programs to be for low-income people. You want them to be for poor people. You don't want them to be for middle class or rich people. And therefore, when poor people stop becoming poor people, you take the programs away. The way to get rid of the cliff effects is to have very long phase-outs, so that you don't go over a cliff, but that you phase out very slowly. Now that happens to be more expensive, but the incentives push in the right direction. So I would argue that, at least analytically, we need to think about moving from cliff effects to long phase-outs. That happens to cost money, and Congress doesn't want to spend money on this Congress isn't that interested in spending money on poor people, which gets you kind of back to Robert's point, which is that we kind of need to change the game.
Thank you very much. Please round of applause to the panel. Mr. Bernstein, Robert, Ralph,